Good afternoon, and thank you for participating in the California Center for International Trade Development's webinar entitled Developing Export Readiness Skills. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping rules I'd like to go over. All lines are muted during the webinar. There will be a limited time available at the end of the presentation for a question and answer session with myself and our presenter. Type your questions in the chat box and please be concise and succinct. We may not have enough time to answer all questions, but we will follow up with you through email afterwards. For a PDF copy of this presentation, please email me directly and I'll be sure to forward it to you. My name is Frank Nunez and I am your host today. I wear many hats at the CITD, but officially I am the Program Development Assistant and I coordinate all our center's export training programs in California. As some of you may know, I am also the project manager and facilitate several reverse trade missions for California each year. I have been with the CITD for 6.5 years now, and each day is a new learning experience for me in the ever-changing world of international trade. The CITD provides introductory and advanced training workshops, seminars, and now webinars periodically throughout the year that are offered at competitive or no cost. We have a team of experts available to assist you with your international trade-related challenges and questions, and even offer a toll-free ag hotline. One of the most popular services that the CITD offers is its market research. As a trade organization, the CITD has access to several resource subscriptions like Euromonitor and peers that would be economically feasible for most private companies to have. What the CITD is most known for is its trade missions. The CITD hosts anywhere from 12 to 15 trade missions each year, whereby we bring foreign importers to California and introduce them to California suppliers. Last year, these missions generated over $32 million in new export sales. I would like to introduce you to our speaker today. Mr. Dennis Lynch is a 32-year veteran of international trade who has held a variety of positions in the public and private sectors. He has been directly involved in monitoring, troubleshooting, and facilitating export transactions for more than 22 years. Dennis is an integral part of the CITD team and our go-to person for food and agricultural issues. He has assisted hundreds of CITD companies with technical assistance, customized market research, and foreign market entry plans. Dennis is a certified global business professional and a member of NASBI, the National Association for Small Business and International Trade Educators. At this time, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Dennis.
Frank, thanks very much. Good afternoon, everybody. We appreciate you spending some of your valuable time with us. We want to talk today about the importance of becoming export ready for California food and agricultural exporters. So our agenda is pretty simple, talking about the tasks required to become export ready and adding value to your customer who really looks at exporters as part of a supply chain. And there are certain things that you can accomplish to become more competitive than other people who don't really work on their skills as much. And that means meeting the expectations that they have even in advance of meeting with them. In other words, becoming export ready and understanding how that all works. So we'll look at some resources for classifying products for exports that you can use for export statistics and understand duties and taxes and marketing research and how to use them for complying with free trade agreements. And overall, in a macro sense, talk about how important it is to balance the marketing communications with operational skills and becoming a good exporter and a good marketer. And then we'll finish up by talking about some do's and don'ts of startup and some challenges and how to avoid them. So export readiness is a term that's been around for many years now, and effectively it's something that needs to take place and is an ongoing education effort in order to be able to meet the buyer expectation. And Frank was describing a lot of the activities that the CITD does. And just like with the suppliers who attend those events, they're asked to complete an evaluation. And overall, most of the buyers are very impressed with the products that we have. They really like the companies and they like the people, but sometimes they choose not to do business with one supplier over another because they don't feel they're actually ready. And what ready means is to be able to execute a transaction without having to be taught every step of the way, even by the importer. So export readiness is that balance that I'm talking about. And if you just imagine yourself as a food and agricultural importer and what kind of expectations you would have of your suppliers, it's a little easier to understand. You want to make sure you get the right product delivered by the right mode of transportation, documented properly and on time at a competitive price and with good communications and follow-up. These are very simple things that need to be done to really become successful. So ready means to be able to execute transactions. There is an export readiness test at CITD.org. If you click on trade assistance and then on ERA or export readiness assessment, it's a series of questions that will help you formulate where you're at and make suggestions on which way to go in order to strengthen your export readiness if you are not. In a nutshell, what buyers expect from export-ready suppliers is to understand the international product coding, and that's why we'll spend time on that today. And if they are in one of the 20 countries now that we have free trade agreements, they would like support in making sure that your product qualifies for the agreement so they can get the best rate of duty possible, even, of course, duty-free. They'd like you to know about their market, even from secondary marketing research, so we'll talk a little bit about that, to understand the food trends and the way business is done, and what kind of retail and wholesale and food processing and food service markets there are. They'd expect you to have at least reviewed labeling requirements if labeling is appropriate for your product, as well as the regulations and paperwork required. They actually would appreciate you knowing where they are, and that requires some geographic study and ports and trade lanes things. And you can get a lot of help from international freight forwarders for that. Sometimes they have their own, but often you'll be required to engage the services of one, and they're integral to your export operation as well. They also expect you to use the metric system because, there's just a couple places in the world that use imperial, and we happen to be one of them in one of the larger markets, but most things are done in trade by the metric system. They would expect that you understand what terms of sale are and what the ramifications are by using different terms in trade, and understanding what the price escalation issues are regarding those terms of sale and the additional costs that they have to pay that are different from your domestic customers. And they'd also like an appreciation of payment mechanisms for trade, currency conversions, using perhaps letters of credit. These are the basic things that we've learned over the years, that there's an expectation that before you engage too much in the export business that you should be working very hard, if not already, on these issues. So let's talk about the harmonized system first. This is an international product coding system, and it's used for a variety of issues in international trade, but primarily it's about the duty. It's about what we call tariff treatment on products. So whether you have canned tomatoes or fresh strawberries or milk and cheese, there's going to be a different tariff treatment on the product, and those products will be coded differently. So that makes up the bulk of a tariff on the import side. Thus, the buyers are very interested in knowing what the product code is for international trade for what you have to sell. We also use these codes for export and import statistics. We use them for market research purposes to look at the top markets for products. You have to understand the rules of origin for free trade agreement and to complete certificates of origin or letters of origin that are based on these codes. And everything that leaves the United States that has a value of over $2,500 with the exception of Canada requires the filing of Exporter Electronic Information, or EEI, which is filed on a software platform called the Automated Export System, or AES. These are what we call 10-digit Schedule B numbers, which is an extension of the 6-digit harmonized system code. So since nothing is imported or exported without them, they're quite important. And it's really valuable to have some mastery over this, whether you're in the food business or not. But the food business has a lot of different varieties of preparation for products, from raw to frozen to fully baked and seasoned and so forth. The codes will change on those. So let's talk a little bit about how you access those. You can go to census.gov. This is the same census that may knock on your door every 10 years. Click on Export Codes at the bottom of the page. There's loads and loads of international trade information in that location. And I'll show you here what the page looks like when you click on that. So there's a few things to point out here. The first is, if you know any or all of your code number, let's say it's cheese, it'll start with 0406. You could just type that in right there, and all the references to 0406 or cheese products are going to come up. If you're not aware of any part of the number, you can click on this, the 3CE Online, which is Commodity Code Classification. It's a search engine that's been developed specifically, which I'll show you here in a second, on how to classify the product. If you have a code that isn't coming up anywhere and people say they don't recognize it, it might be obsolete. So you can click on here. There's a lot of changes every year in these codes, and so if you click on here, it'll show you what's been done away with it and what the new code is that's replaced it. Okay, that's census.gov. Click on Export Codes. Just as an example, I typed in grape so you can see how it works. And there's two sets of questions that it asks. It's going to ask you if it's artificial or used for animal feed or flour, mixed, candied, or chocolate coated. But really, it knows the variety of preparation for grapes, so it's either fresh or chilled, dried or frozen, provisionally preserved, which is inedible, or if it's been preserved and prepared. So those are your choices. So we just say, well, we're looking for fresh grapes at the moment. So you click on that, and your choices for grapes that are fresh or dried. So raisins are in here down below what you're looking at. So 8080610 is the HS code for fresh grapes. And then there's two 4-digit extensions that create the export Schedule V number. There's 0010 for organic and 0050 for non-organic. And these statistics are a little bit dated. I wouldn't really use them, but there are ways to get more updated statistics that I'll show you shortly. Okay. And so that's how you do that. Now, when you also need to, like I said, with those 20 countries, understand that they've been developed over time, as recently as Halloween 2012 with Panama, but it goes all the way back to 1986 with Israel. So they use a very similar platform, but the vocabulary is a little bit different, and whether you need to issue a certificate or not is a little bit different. So if you go to this website, export.gov, that should be pretty easy to remember, as long as you don't put .com. And if you click on NAFTA certificate, if you want to learn all about NAFTA, you go in there and read. But if you want to look at all the trade agreement information for different countries, you click on Learn to Benefit from FTAs. On that same page, there's another link that I'll show you here that says HS Codes, Tariffs, and Taxes. These are for other countries that we do not have free trade agreements with. It's very much a value-added service to your customer. Lots of countries, particularly in Central and South America, don't have the same access that we do for these agreements, and they wonder sometimes if they're doing it properly and what the rate of duty is on their own products. So very helpful to study that too. So this is the front page of export.gov, and here's where I said click on the NAFTA certificate, and then over here you can see it says HS Codes, Tariffs, and Taxes. And of course there's lots of stuff in this website as well, but right now we're talking specifically about the code. So that's how you access that information. If you click on the NAFTA certificate, there's your source, but you also notice it says Learn to Benefit from FTAs. So this would be the other countries that we have free trade agreements with, okay? All quite simple, just offering up a valuable resource. And in fact, the number one resource for exporting food and agricultural products is from the Foreign Agricultural Service, which is the International Marketing Division of USDA that has over 80 overseas offices that are called Agricultural Trade Offices, or ATOs. And if you haven't ever gone into this website, I would highly recommend it, as long as you're patient and you have some time to read and kind of navigate what it is that you're looking for. It's extremely valuable to access. Most common reports that are accessed are the exporter guides, which are updated. Most of these are updated every year, particularly if there's any changes. The food and ag import regulations and standards, which are referred to as FAIRs. And in some cases for perishable items, they do a product-specific FAIRs because those regulations on perishables can change during the course of a year. Also, for paperwork purposes, they have the Export Certificate Report that we refer to as CERTs. And depending on your particular sector, whether you have a retail product or food service product or an ingredient that's used in food processing, you would be accessing various reports like that. So let me show you how to access all that information. This is the front page of the FAS website. And there's two ways to go in. If you click on Exporting U.S. Products, it'll take you into the market research resources where you can run your export statistics that are also based on your HS code or Schedule B number. And for these reports that I'm talking about, you click up here on the top right, I want to read attaché reports. And these are called GAIN reports as well, Global Agricultural Information Network. Once you open up those reports, you have a little programming to do, and I would start with the dates. And usually go back 2 years, so this automatically defaults to January 2013, so I just put 11, and then ran it through the date that I did this, which was 10/30. And usually we go right to exporter assistance. There are other things in there, but that's where all these reports I'm talking about are. As you can see, I checked the boxes off for all the ones that I showed you, and then I went over here and chose the country. In this case, for example purposes, it's Mexico. Okay, so let's see what comes up for Mexico from FAS. And right away you see that you have your food service sector report, your retail sector report, and then some product-specific reports about corn dough and egg certification, and a new report on niche products in the perceived healthy food market in Mexico. So the list could just go on, but right away you see how quickly you're able to access this information. So certainly if you have any particular interest in researching countries in this way, you want to spend some time in there, without a doubt. Okay, highly recommended. You also need to build a good trade team for your export operations. If you've got some already, that's great, but always be working with the right people who have experience in your industry and your countries of destinations, including export assistance providers and service providers. So you say, well, what's the difference between the two? The CITD is a California export assistance provider, doing most of the work either at no fee or just a low fee to cover administration costs that coming from federal and state government resources. So ultimately, at the top of the tier, it's the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and then their International Marketing Division, the Foreign Agricultural Service. And at the state level, you have the California Department of Food and Agriculture and the State Agricultural Promotion Agency, which is the CITD. You also have what's called the State Regional Trade Group, located in Washington State. This is the Western United States Agricultural Trade Association. And then you also have the Commercial Service from the U.S. Department of Commerce and the Small Business Administration and the Ex-Im Bank, and really numbers and dozens of other organizations that are doing export support during the course of the year. Often it's grant-related and can change over time, which means you kind of have to keep on the lookout for that. So export assistance providers are nonprofits, to put it simply. Export service providers are for-profit operations, which include banks, international forwarders, consolidators, many of them very food-specific, or export management or trading companies, or carriers of different types like trucking companies, airlines, steamship lines, and logistics companies. There could be a little overlap between forwarders, consolidators, and carriers and logistics too, but they do stand out on their own. So in the food business, a lot of them specialize in certain kind of products and certain kind of markets. So it's kind of important to be able to make sure that you've got the right assembly of people around you. I'm going to take a quick break and turn it over to Frank, who's going to share some information with you. Frank?
Thank you, Dennis. The CITD has the following activities that will be taking place in the near future. This Thursday, we'll be hosting the webinar Working with Buyers, Communication, Presentation, and Follow-Up in the same format as today. This event will start at noon, and we have 1 day left to register. On February 11, 2014, the CITD will be hosting its annual International Trade Symposium at the World Ag Expo in Tulare, California. This year's topics include Going Global, Expand Your Horizon, Your Career, and Your Future. the new global consumer, importance of American-made agricultural machinery exports in the U.S. economy, and how will the Trans-Pacific Partnership affect agricultural trade. These seminars are free with your paid admission to the World Ag Expo and are a great supplement to your international trade education. The CITD has opened registration for its flagship annual export certificate program called the CalAgX. This program trains companies through the entire export process and is only available to specialty crop producers and distributors. As part of this program, we not only help you develop a market entry plan, but we will work with you side by side to help you implement this plan. Our goal is to provide you with all the tools necessary to put you in a position to expand your sales to a global market. The CalAgX program starts in March 2014. For additional information on these and future events, please visit our events page on our website at www.fresnocitd.org/events. At this time, I'd like to turn the presentation back over to Dennis.
Frank, thanks very much. It's really important to talk about geography as long as we're talking about shipping, and there are a lot of different ports out there in different countries. Colombia is a very good example. If you notice that it receives ocean freight from the United States, from the Caribbean Sea, from the Atlantic Ocean via the Panama Canal, from the Pacific Ocean via the Panama Canal, and from the Pacific Ocean directly. So in that regard, from the West Coast in particular, it's important to find the most logical export location, which appears to be Houston, actually, for most of the West Coast products leaving. There could be opportunity to sail further down the Pacific side or all the way over to Miami and come down from that side. It depends. So it's really important to discuss the routes with the freight forwarder if needed. In other words, many times importers are going to have a pretty good idea of their preferred port, but they may not know where you are. And so it's a lot easier, of course, to ship to Asian destinations from the West Coast because there's nothing in the way. But to the rest of the world, it can become a little bit more complicated. This map and a lot of valuable country infrastructure information is available at CIA.gov. They do have the World Factbook in there called the World Library. There's also some other websites called World Port Source, Ports.com, and AllWorldShipping.com that have excellent information on different ports in the world and how cargo is received in a different country. So that's part of understanding where these countries are. It's a great location at the CIA.gov to read all about the country, too. It really helps convey the effort that you're putting into understanding the market by understanding a lot about the country as well. I can't say enough good things about international freight forwarders. They're absolutely imperative to find the right one and to work with them. They mainly would represent you as the seller to the buyer, but they might be representing the buyer and vice versa. If it's the buyer's forwarder, they'll be approaching you. And primarily, they work directly with ocean carriers and airlines and common carriers like trucking companies and forwarding agents. These are people who buy very large amounts of space on ships and aircraft and then resell it to people. They also represent you to U.S. Customs on the way out of the United States. They do work with chambers of commerce, getting certificates of origin prepared. They do legal work with foreign consulates when the country requires legalization of your documents. And depending on the method of payment, they would be working with the U.S. bank on your behalf. So very, very relevant to your entire operation. So there is a database where you can research different ones. There's a lot of forwarders in California, particularly in the northern side. In here, this is from the Agricultural Marketing Service of USDA.gov. You go to that website and you click on the agricultural transportation, then transportation research and information, and then on directory of freight forwarders. And then you have some more drop-downs like the market research I showed you earlier. You can separate by state, you can separate by services, and by the destinations that they serve. So they'll tell you whether they consolidate ocean freight or not, what their particular product expertise is, like if they do dairy or if they do fresh fruits and vegetables or they do meat products, etc. and they'll tell you where they ship to, which is more than likely where they have agency representation. So take advantage of that, and you can make some calls and talk to different people and see if there's a good match between your type of products and the destinations that you're interested in. I mentioned earlier about consolidation. This is true in the food business. A lot of people think that everything just goes by the container. That's actually not true at all. A lot of food products, particularly processed value-added food products, go in consolidations. What's also developed over the last 20 years is that a lot of importers of food products have their own consolidators in the United States, particularly in Oakland. There's a very large population of them for shipping off the West Coast. And these are people that the importer has contacted to do their consolidation for them. The main reason is that they like to get 5 or 6 or 8 orders from different suppliers around the western United States or even across the whole country into one container, because you pay a customs clearance fee at the destination by the bill of lading, which means that if they have 10 orders in a container, they're only going to pay 1 customs clearance fee instead of 10 different customs clearance fees in 10 different containers of one shipment. And that's going to save them, that's $1,800 probably right there, just in one container. So in addition to the fact that they get all their orders at one place. So in this case, the consolidator would be representing the buyer and contacting you, and your responsibility would be to ship to the consolidator and not to the destination. They turn around and load the container up and ship it off. If the buyer does not have a consolidator, they might ask you to ship them a few pallets or so directly. You would be working with an international freight forwarder that does ocean freight consolidations, and there might be 10 or 15 different orders in that container arranged by you. So when the container gets there, they open this one up and start giving out pallets to different people. When this one gets there and they open the doors, all the freight is for the same person, but it's from 8 or 10 different people. So that's the difference, and definitely something that will probably happen to people if you don't work in the bulk food market. It's definitely a big fact of life in the food export business. I also mentioned the importance of using the metric system. And even in the United States, in the census.gov site I showed you with the export codes, everything in there is also in the metric system. And in fact, there's also a list in there that has identifies all the different types of measurements for different products, like kilos and metric tons and liters and pieces and things. And there's also a really nice conversion table available online called metricconversion.us, which you can put your imperial figures in there and ask what you're looking for, and it'll do the measurement for you. So particularly in the food business, a lot of tariff treatment is based on weight and measure, and so it's really important to have an accurate list of products coded properly in the metric system, and continue to appreciate that for as you go along, because that's how you talk to people. You don't give them ounces and pounds, although many of them probably are familiar with it. They'd really prefer to talk in their own system, and as somebody who's selling to customers, then you would really want to adhere to that too. So highly recommended. Another area that's really important to understand is trade terms. And trade terms are picking a location between your facility where the product is available to be picked up and their facility where the product is able to be delivered. There's a lot of different transfer points in there, so we usually refer to them in the United States as abbreviations like CIP. That means carriage and insurance paid. We can also refer to that as an acronym. For example, in Europe, they would say SIP. And so it's an acronym and it's also an abbreviation. It's important to name a specific geographic location right after that, to make sure that the buyer and the seller are understanding where the exchange of having to pay for something goes, who's got control over the documentary title of the product at certain times, who's got the insured interest for liability, and who's responsible for issuing certain documents, and this includes to customs. So they're very important to understand clearly. However, in the United States and around the world to an extent, but we certainly have a lot of confusion over these because there's a lot of outdated and overlapping terms of sale that are out there. So you have to make sure you use the most modern set of terms, which I'm going to show you here. A lot of people use the American Foreign Trade definitions from 1941. They were done away with in 1984. The Uniform Commercial Code also had trade terms in there, and those were done away in 2004. So already almost 10 years, and there's older set of Incoterms that are out there, but we are recommending everybody use Incoterms 2010, which is really the most modern set of terms that's in effect today. And so some people are still using the 2000 terms, but it's time to shift. I always tell people, if you like to have the most updated cell phone and other technologies and you're in the export business, you'd like to be able to use the most modern set of trade terms too. And that's Incoterms 2010. And it's available from the International Chamber of Commerce. And it's iccbooks.com. You can see the website right here. And I think it costs like $52 for this book. It's not really that large, but it runs through all the different terms. These became effective January 1st, 2011. So they're just coming up on the third birthday now. And this is what everybody in the world should be using because that's what they've been designed to do, to allow buyers and sellers to understand what different types of quotations mean. And I'll show you how these are lined up. Now, this set is for what they call any mode or modes of transport, which they're referring to as omnimodal. It's another term for intermodal, which I'm sure you've all heard, which means that products can get from point A to point B by a variety of different transport modes, including truck and rail and vessel and air and maybe a truck again or another rail on the same bill of lading. You don't have to issue different bills of lading for different modes of transport. So everything that goes in ocean containers, those are called intermodal containers, should be using these terms, and that includes ex-works, EXW. A lot of people say FOB factory. Well, that's one of those outdated terms. In 2011, we're recommending ex-works and beyond, of course. People say, well, FOB Oakland. Well, the correct term is actually free carrier, FCA Oakland. CPT and CIP are the equivalent of what people call cost and freight and cost insurance and freight, but these are for intermodal ocean container terms. So that's the recommendation. And then they have some new terms for delivery because that's where a lot of confusion was. Delivered at terminal, at destination. Now this would be over the border and into the other country. And delivered at place, which is a duty-neutral term, meaning you would be willing to pay for delivering something but not for the customs clearance and duties. For that term, which is effectively an international door-to-door shipment, use DDP. And these are probably most appropriate for courier use. In other words, something that the people like FedEx or UPS can carry under their arms, but it's not for pallets of food products. It's really not a good idea to own product in another country unless it's Canada under their non-resident importer program. Otherwise, I certainly wouldn't recommend it. These terms you might recognize because they've been around a lot longer. These are what we call rules for sea and inland waterway transport, which includes barge, free alongside ship, free on board vessel, at the port of departure only, for ocean freight only. That's what FOB means in Incoterms. It doesn't mean anything else but. So that's a term that gets a lot of people in trouble because they misunderstand it. Then there's CFR and CIF. So these are what they're calling marine restricted rules. In other words, they are not recommended for air or intermodal or containerized shipment. And therein lies most of the confusion about these. So I would just recommend a little bit thorough study of these as you go along to understand that most international trade works, that there's an origin, and that generally the product isn't going to be exported from that origin. Even if it's in Oakland, it still has to get from somewhere in Oakland to the port, right? And that would involve using an F term. So F means it hasn't left the country yet. There's been no main carriage undertaken. And that would include FCA for intermodal traffic and for bulk, FAS and FOB. The main carriage, which is the port of departure to the port of arrival, includes carriage paid to and carriage and insurance paid for intermodal traffic, cost and freight, and cost insurance and freight for bulk sea freight. Okay, and then you have your arrivals, DAT, terminal, DAP, place, and delivered duty paid, which is, again, the door-to-door shipment. When you use these terms and you're negotiating quotations with buyers, you have to understand that your invoice will get higher the further you're committing to shipping it to the buyer. And so, in other words, your Ex Works invoice is your lowest one, and your DDP would be the highest. And usually people are using FCA or CIP for exports of food products. So ultimately, the buyer's concern and whether or not they decide to purchase from you are based on your product price, but they're also based on a number of other issues, including what the type of product it is, what the duty and taxes on the product, so where's the destination, how is it being shipped, how is it being financed, what are the service provider fees for freight and handling and documentation. So you might often hear buyers say, I want your net price. And that means they're not looking for your U.S. price if your U.S. price has domestic overhead in it, such as broker fees and royalties and things that are not applicable to export products. They prefer you remove those because they have a lot of things to pay for that domestic customers don't. And so when they tell you that your price is a little bit too high, it doesn't mean they're trying to get a higher margin. It means they're trying to fit it into the market. If you take, this is a rather drastic example, but you take a difference in a manufactured net price for export, you don't have any transport at CIF and no duty on the value. And so you look right there already, you've got, another $1.97 added to the price that are not equivalent for the U.S. market. So ultimately, you can see that, the product is, if it's priced the same as it is in the United States, it's going to be a lot higher than the U.S. equivalent. There are cases where that can certainly happen, but overall, they prefer to try and be a little bit closer. So they'd say, well, this 325 is about 18% too high. We need you to mark that down because we need to get this down to like 950. And that's a big part of the conversation, particularly that value-added food importers discuss, because they're looking at the shelf price. So there is a lot of price escalation in export that isn't the same as the domestic equivalent. What we also find is the margins on U.S. Sales are often higher than they are internationally, and that I've seen products like barbecue sauce sell for the same price in Costa Rica that it does in California. And it's made in California, which means people are making quite a bit of money because it got all the way to Costa Rica and cleared customs and got into a supermarket there, and it's about the same price. It's like 7 cents off. So quite interesting. As I also mentioned when we started, it's important to understand about payment. And this has become less complicated over the last 10 years. There's a lot of things that have kind of streamlined this. 20 years ago, it was much more difficult for a lot of countries to obtain U.S. dollars without having to pay a lot. And the government controlled the outflow of those currencies, and so they were very slow to pay U.S. exporters. And a lot of buyers now have their own dollar-based accounts. More countries are even using dollars and have much more ready access to it. And, of course, you'd like to be paid in dollars. But ultimately still, you want to get to know your customer and make sure that if you're extending any credit, even eventually, that they're viable. One of the things that I hear quite often myself, the first thing is that people say, I didn't realize that exporting was so easy. They said, I really thought this was very, dangerous and et cetera, but those people also work very hard to understand how to export, not just who to export to. So they have that balance that I'm talking about. They're operationally strong, but they're savvy marketers. That's important too. But if you can't back it up with being technically sound in your operations, buyers are less likely to want to work with you, and it's going to be harder to succeed. And that's why we put so much emphasis on export education at the CITD. So there's still a spectrum. There's still different methods of payment in different countries and different values that are going to impact that. But effectively, if you've sent something off to another country and you haven't been paid, it could be a gift. And obviously, you would either like to be prepaid or have some great assurance that you're going to be paid, whether you've insured your invoice or you've got a big down payment to make sure that there's a commitment from the buyer. Ultimately, that spectrum is the opposite for buyers, that any prepayment they make and they're waiting 5 weeks to get the product arrived at their port is a donation until they actually get them. So they have trust issues too. Now, the other thing, in addition to people telling me that this turns out to be quite a bit easier, that the quality of the buyers, particularly what Frank is referring to with these inbound missions and the trade missions that they do, very high quality buyers that have been vetted to a good extent. And a lot of people tell me, wow, these customers that I have for export are actually, many of them, better than my domestic customers. So it's a twofold surprise for them. A very high level of customer, very trustworthy, and at the same time, not at all difficult as they thought. And that's why it's really important to study. And that's what I've been seeing for many years now, is that it's really important to embrace this, like I said, with that balance of sex. So the thing about there's an issue between buyers and the sellers, and maybe looking at it illustrated might be more relevant, is that for an exporter, the least secure is going to be open account. The most secure, of course, is cash. Now, many buyers, they don't have a huge problem prepaying cash up to a certain amount. But if they really want the product and they really think they can benefit by it and make a profit, they don't really have a problem with that as long as they can trust you. See, this is a two-way street. There's a least secure and a most secure for both the buyer and the seller. And that's why it's important to develop export readiness skills as well, so buyers develop more confidence in you. So in between having an open account on both sides and having to pay cash on both sides, you have documentary credits and collections. And collection is the use of a draft. And the paperwork actually goes through banks and not directly to the buyer, and the documents aren't turned over to the buyer until they pay either at site, that's what they call the site draft, or over a time period, which is a time draft. So they might sign the draft, get the documents, and promise to pay in 30 or 60 days. That's a draft. The letter of credit is a little bit different. It includes the use of a draft, but it also is an obligation by the buyer's bank to pay the exporter, provided that they've done everything that they've obligated themselves to do. Okay? And so a little bit to study there as well. So in both cases, letters of credit can be a little bit more expensive than paying cash, but buyers are not averse to them if it's a good way to finance, especially if they can get open account from you and an attractive interest rate, perhaps from the U.S. as well. So let's begin to wrap this up by talking about some things that are not a good idea to do, that I've learned over 17 years of working with food exporters. A lot of people make very similar mistakes, so you can diagnose it pretty easily over time. And one thing that people do is they have, in their own spectrum, a lot of people think exporting is quite easy, but they haven't actually done it yet. Or maybe they've just shipped to Canada. Now they have an order to Malaysia. There's a big difference. And a lot of people think it's too hard. Oh, I heard you never get paid and people rip you off and it's terrible. Well, there is a dark side to exporting, but there's also a lot of real high-quality opportunities, and many of them in the food and agricultural business. That's why we're talking about them today. So there's different aspects to this. It can be hard if you haven't learned how, and it can be hard if you are not thorough, and it can be hard if you think it's easy. It's neither easy or hard. It'll be different depending on you, your company, your product, and your markets. But one thing that's important to always remember is that studying the market and studying how to reach it and learning how to export are the things you need to do, not just decide rhetorically whether it's easy or hard. Another thing that's really important is that you have to be patient and you have to be interested in learning. So if you're impatient and you're uninterested in learning, it's going to be hard. That's the whole point. Don't be confused over those terms of trade. We spent a little time on that today. This is just basically an introductory webinar, so it's just making recommendations on things for you to study later. But when somebody says they want to buy from you FOB, the first thing you do is say, are you using Incoterms 2010? And this is what FOB means. I don't think you're using that. And they'll probably say, no, I just say FOB like everybody does. Well, that's inappropriate. And speaking of inappropriate, you don't want to use a cookie-cutter approach to markets or inappropriate correspondence. You need to be businesslike in your communications, and don't write emails, for example, that are too long, attached documents. I call it being formal but friendly. And, take the lead of the buyer. If they become more informal with you, then you go ahead. But you shouldn't instigate that. That there's still a lot of diplomacy in this. And, thinking all the markets are the same and all the buyers are the same, well, that's certainly not true either. So, again, some people who export to Canada think that exporting to Malaysia is going to be the same. It's not. And nor is it to Singapore or Spain or Russia. It's always going to be a little different. There is no cookie-cutter approach to this. You have to use the metric system, study free trade agreements, understand they're not free. A lot of people think we sign a free trade agreement with a country like Panama and all the duties are free immediately and there's no more regulations and no labeling requirements. Well, that's all not true. Free trade agreements are just designed that over time you're lowering the rates of duty until they become free. Some products are free from duty from the first day, but some can take 15 or 20 years. So you'd like to study that in export.gov to see, what the situation is for your particular product. And then you have people who say, in order to get into a market, I only need a label, or I only need the regulations, or I only need buyers. None of those are true either, just like it's easy or hard, not true. You need a holistic approach to every market and every customer. There isn't only one thing that you need. There's going to be a checklist every time, and it's important to learn how to build one of those checklists every time. A lot of it is going to be based on your own products and your own company policies, and so got to consider that as well. The hardest thing to do is to try and learn how to export after somebody's already placed an order. It's really awkward, and it puts a lot of stress on everybody, yourself and everybody that is trying to help you, because you put, one foot out there and in front of the other, and they should have gone at the same time. So, again, you need to learn how as well as who, and it's really unfortunate that a lot of people do this. A lot of it's because of the internet and emailing, and then finally somebody says, send me a container of this, and you're like, how do I do that? So don't let that happen to you. It's awful. What I recommended is to be realistic about expectations, is that if you're in a big hurry, you probably shouldn't be. Sometimes this takes time. It's international trade. Nothing is set in stone. There's a lot of variables and there's a lot of surprises, both pleasant and sometimes unpleasant. You give yourself time in that regard to learn by osmosis, which by that I mean if you study something enough, when you start to learn it, it just becomes rote. You just start to say the words and you know what they mean. You know your metric system and you know your resources and you know Incoterms. You've built an operational base by which you understand international trade. That's a huge benefit to your company because that's what it takes in order to succeed in the export market. Avoid rumors. That's more rhetoric. Somebody says this is a hot market or somebody says this is a terrible market. You don't know if that's true. You don't know if that's true for your product. You don't know if somebody is just repeating something they heard. What I find, too, is a lot of people who are negative about a country or exporting in general did something wrong themselves. Nothing happened to them. They did it to themselves. Self-inflicted wounds is what we call it, because they didn't learn how to export, so they made mistakes. They thought it was easy. They said, just ship it. And they're sharing their pain with other people who are working on trying to understand exporting, and it just doesn't work out that way. Make sure you stay focused on your target markets and your market segments. Don't get drawn off into countries that you already know don't have a great potential. Stay focused. Focus on building relationships. Don't use selling anymore. Appreciate cultural nuances. Understand the diplomacy that's involved. Make education a part of your annual agenda. Understand export price escalation and delegate responsibility to people who like to read and can report back to you. People that are analytical. That has to be part of this, okay? So in closing, I would just say my final thoughts are, think about the future. Determine your core competence based on your products and your price and your service levels. Think about marketing strategies when you're introducing new products. Become a good supplier. Become part of a supply chain. Become a reliable communicator and deliverer of product. Support your customers. Go to the market. Give them promotions. Give them updates on products. Make sure they know what's going on. Send new samples. Come up with advertising campaigns. Consider using the branded program from Wasada, for example, which helps with marketing promotions. Stay in good touch, like I said, and visit. Make them feel important because they probably should be. Okay, that's all the time I have right now. I'm going to turn it over to Frank, and we're going to begin the Q&A session. Frank?
Thank you, Dennis. We have a few questions. I'm going to go ahead and start with the first one. When will this PowerPoint and the recording of this webinar be available? Our target is to have these available for next week on our website at www.fresnocigd.org. We'll go ahead and send a link to everybody after it's up and available. The next question we have is, we want to export tortillas. They ship frozen, but they sell slacked out and thawed. Should the HS code be frozen or thawed?
Well, that's a very good question. In export.gov, where I showed you earlier, where we looked at the grapes there, you can type in tortilla, and it will ask you whether it's frozen or not, as it would with all bread products. And that particular reason that you're looking at those codes is to file that exporter electronic information that I mentioned earlier. And what they're looking for is the condition that it's exported in. So in that case, I would be using the frozen code because they want to know how it's shipped and not how it's actually used once it gets there, because ultimately everything frozen is going to be thawed. So if you were shipping, where you didn't have to freeze, let's say you were selling to Canada, you would be using a different code for the same product, but it would be based on the condition that it's exported in. So good question.
Okay, the next question we have is, I see you mentioned organic grapes, and they have their own classification code. Are there organic HS codes for tomato sauce?
That's another good question. A little bit of background. The organic codes were introduced about 3 years ago, mostly for fruits and vegetables, by the Organic Trade Association lobbying with the Bureau of Census. They did, interestingly enough, add in a code for tomato sauce, and I think that was because a lot of organic tomatoes are grown and turned into sauce. And they also introduced one for coffee, because I think a lot of people trade in organic coffee now, a lot of that fair trade coffee. So the answer is yes, there is for tomato sauce, but there isn't for any other sauce. And there aren't any for any, finished goods, anything that's sold at retail. But there is an organic code for tomato sauce. I think it's 210330 is the HS code, and then there's 2 different Schedule Bs like with the grapes, one for organic and one for non.
The last question we have submitted is, where can I find export statistics for my products?
Well, if you don't mind, let me just back up to where I briefly mentioned that, and we can talk about it a little bit more. And that is, on this slide here, I had mentioned earlier, if you click here on exporting U.S. products, the next page will open up, and it's going to say marketing research. and you click on that, and it opens up and gives you some more different links that you can open. And the next one, it says Marketing Research Resources. Open that, and it says Bulk, Intermediate, and Consumer-Oriented Database. It's called BICO. And so what they've done in there, Foreign Agricultural Service, separated bulk Schedule B numbers from intermediate products, often those are ingredients, from consumer-oriented products, which would be like a finished tomato sauce. And if you know your HS code, in the top right of that screen, you can plug it in and you can start running a different export data, including to all countries in the world or to all regions in the world. And you can even change it just from your state. So if you wanted to see, what organic tomato sauce is being exported from California, for example, you can do that in there. So over here is where we spend a little more time on the attaché reports. But if you want to look at export statistics, you can do that in here as long as you have that HS code and Schedule B number. Again, go into BICO, Bulk, Intermediate, and Consumer-Oriented Database, and use the drop-downs, which are very similar to the market research ones that we also looked at.
Great. Well, thank you, Dennis. Well, that's all the time we have today for questions. For those that ask questions, we will go ahead and follow up with you with an email just to make sure we answered them correctly, or if there's any additional information you have. If anyone has any questions that they can think of that they want to send after this presentation, please email them to us at citd@sccd.edu. And please complete the post-event survey at the end of this presentation. And if you visit our webpage often, you can see upcoming events and trade leads at www.fresnocitd.org. If you have any additional questions or comments, please contact us at area code 559-324-6401. Thank you, and have a great rest of your afternoon.